Our next author, Arlaina Goddard, does our layout and design work for the journal. So when you thumb through the volumes, the last couple of volumes, that's her work. That's what gives the journal such a polished presentation. But she made the mistake of saying she might be interested in writing an article, and we said, all right. So this is her first article on the Beaver hat at Rendezvous. I do want to tell one story about Arlaina. The story goes that when she first met her in-laws, they set her down and made her watch Jeremiah Johnson and watched her reaction very closely to see if she was worthy of their son. And she passed. So I'd like to introduce Arlaina. She has found some great stuff about the hat trade as it was during the Rendezvous period.
Okay, we'll see if this is loud enough. Thank you guys for coming, and as Scott said, yes, this is my first article. I'm an amateur historian and article writer. This is my first attempt of ever doing this kind of stuff, scholarly article to be published. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped edit my first draft and get it to where it is now. So I'm really excited about that. So as I'm sure people would agree, the people that are into history and start doing research of their own and really start digging into stuff, a lot of times you come across little tidbits in a big picture of history that sometimes you can get a little fixated on, a little fascinated with. And for me, that was urine, which sounds really weird, but I promise that it'll explain how this article got to where it is now. So when I first started working at the museum about 6 years ago, when people would come in, we would start by giving them a tour, and we'd start here at our Beaver display case, and I would tell them not many people realize that this was the cause of the fur trade. This is why men came out here. They trapped a beaver, they sent him back to the hat factories, they would make these beaver top hats, and they would use mercury on these beaver top hats, and that's where the term mad as a hatter came from. And that was kind of the end of my short little history lesson. I would leave it at that. And people always found that last part to be pretty fascinating. They didn't realize that the two histories were connected. So I started getting a little bit more into that history too, started doing some additional research on mercury. And what I found was there were so many different theories and legends on the discovery of mercury in hatting that nobody could really come up with an exact answer of how it was discovered. But one of the theories that really stood out to me because it was just bizarre was when I was looking through a history of mercury or quicksilver book, and in it it says, the felting process began with camel hair in what is now a part of Turkey. The hair of camels was made into tough felt material for tents. It was discovered that the felting process was accelerated with the urine of the camel. The art was brought back to Western Europe by the followers of the Crusades. It became the habit for the workers to urinate on the fibers before felting them. The story goes that one particular workman was being treated with mercury for a venereal disease. It was noticed that his fibers, after the treatment mentioned above, felted quicker and better than that of his more healthy comrades. The secret, which gave the process the name le secretage in French. This may be an old wives' tale, but it has been passed down in the felt hat industry as the origin of the use of mercury. And this was really crazy to me because I thought, okay, not only are people peeing on hats, but how would you even go about proving that? So I started digging into it, and there are, okay, there are a lot of period correct sources and documentation on the use of mercury in the medical field. And so you can actually find documentation of doctors that would be prescribing mercury as treatment for their patients with syphilis. And not only that, but mercury at the time was kind of known as a cure-all. In fact, it was prescribed to Lewis and Clark on their expedition in the form of laxatives, and also later to Abraham Lincoln as an antidepressant. So I thought, okay, so that part of the story can be backed up, that they were definitely using mercury to treat people with a venereal disease. Now, how would we prove that they were using urine in hatting, and that was a little harder to come by. But I was really excited when, in my internet findings, I stumbled upon this. So this is an 1829 hat maker's manual from London, and it was a bunch of different hat factories in London at the time commissioned this hatter that had been in the trade for many years to compile and put together a manual. And in this manual, lo and behold, I found the hats are first boiled in an iron boiler in a mixture of about 1 part urine to 6 parts soft water from 6 to 8 hours. And I thought, I found it. There you go. That solves the mystery. And that kind of satisfied my curiosity in terms of history of mercury. And so with this research, I put together my first draft of this article about 3 years ago. So this year, when I was submitting the article, the journal editorial team kindly suggested maybe it needed a more directed focus, less urine, more fur trade. Totally understandable. This is the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. So we started doing some more research into this manual, and it really is just an invaluable source. It's a period source. It's 1829. This is right in the middle of our Rendezvous era, which is 1825 to 1840. And it lays out very detailed how to make a hat. So in looking at this, we found 2 very important points. The first one was in a section called stuff hats. It says, stuff hats appear to have been originally made throughout of beaver. The instructions given in the old accounts of hat making, old accounts, are to mix 3 parts of old coat with 2 parts of castor. But hats made after this method would be much higher in price than any now in general use. So remember, this was 1829. The second point was in this manual, there was no mention of the use of mercury, nor was there any mention of the use of mercury in other period correct sources that we were trying to cross-reference to prove it. So these were really the 2 points that this article evolved into and is trying to prove. Now, this manual we mainly used in the article to describe how to make a hat during this time. And if you look through the article, it's really laid out step for step. There are a lot of steps to make a hat, but if any of you went home and tried to attempt to make a hat, I'm pretty sure you could based on how much detail we put into this article. And really, the whole process of making a felt hat, and the reason why felt was so important was that felt is the cohesive gathering of the fibers of the material that you use for the hat into one solid, steady piece of fabric. So it was the preferred choice for hats at the time. It was the most durable fabric. And really the 2 materials that you could make a felted hat out of would have been wool, which is what the manual mainly laid out. And this hat would have been known as a cordie. So a cordie was just your average Joe woolen hat. It's what most of the workers would have worn at the time. It's what actually most of the mountain men, when they came out here, would have worn. And then the second material would have been animal fur. So this article in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal this year is really just a condensed version of what's in the manual. So it was generally thought and accepted that the beaver that was coming out of the Rocky Mountain during the Rendezvous was being shipped back to these hat factories, and that hats were making these top hats out of beaver, and that's why they were called beaver hats. That's why these hats were so expensive. That's why the gentleman at the time would have paid a pretty penny, and not only to buy the hat, but also a case to protect their investment, and also why the mountain men at the Rendezvous would have made so much selling a beaver pelt. But according to the manual, apparently they weren't making hats this way anymore in 1829 for some time. And we'll go back and revisit that quote, which talked about the old coat and castor. So castor is obviously beaver. So stuff hats used to be made with old coat. Old coat was coats or robes made out of beaver that were made by the Native Americans and worn by the Native Americans. And by their friction, their body heat, and even their oils from sweat would have naturally felted this beaver So when they traded it during the North American fur trade, they traded it for quite a bit. And this was pretty invaluable to the hat factories that they were sent back to, because it essentially skipped a whole step of felting in the process of making a beaver hat. So as that quote had said, though, hats used to be made this way. Why not anymore? Because old coat no longer was a sustainable resource, and the demand for beaver hats grew so large that it just couldn't keep up with it. Now this picture is an 1822 painting by an artist, Franz Kruger, and this is just the perfect depiction of not only the demand for hats, but the production of these hats during this time. You can see almost every head in the audience, mostly gentlemen, are covered with a felted hat. Now, what was the reason for the demand for these hats? Why did so many people want them? Well, the first was because, as we had kind of talked about before, beaver is the best material for making a felted hat. So the beaver fur, the barbs of the beaver fur, have these kind of forks or spikes, if you will, on them. So when they are met with other barbs or hairs of the beaver fur, it kind of naturally Velcro together. And so it made a more natural felt than, say, like the smooth hair of another animal's fur. So really it was the quality. Everybody wanted a beaver hat because it was such a good quality hat. And the second is so beaver for centuries actually has been known as the best material for felting, and that's still the case today. If you went into a hat shop today and you asked for their most expensive hat, most likely it would be made with the most amount of beaver. And that's actually called the X factor. So there would be a number with the letter X somewhere on the inside of the band, and that signifies how much beaver or percentage of beaver is actually in the hat. So the higher the X, the more beaver. And actually called the Cowboy Shop downtown. They have a really good selection of quality hats. You should check them out. And I asked the salesman what their most expensive hat was. He said that it was a 200X cowboy hat for $800. And I asked him if he could guess how much beaver would it probably contain, and he said probably about 60%. So that just goes to show beaver throughout the years and even today, the best material for making a hat. So the second reason for the demand for these hats and why there was so much production was because of the popularity of these hats and the connotation that these hats carried. So you can see in this picture, every man wearing this hat was so concerned with their appearance. They wanted to fit into society. So beaver top hat would have been a tangible representation of somebody's social and financial status in society. So anybody who is anybody wanted a beaver top hat if you could get one. Now, and just to show that, here is a couple of ads from an 1833 Philadelphia Inquirer. And in these old newspapers, it's amazing to see if you thumb through them. There are whole pages of just ad after ad after ad for hats. And you can see in these ads how many times the word beaver or castor is mentioned in these ads. So that leads to the question. If so many people were buying these beaver hats and they weren't being made of that much beaver at the time, what was the story? What was going on? And the reason for this is, according to the manual, it said, ingenuity has contrived a method of making the most of the materials employed by placing the best side outwards. This is done by laying on the body of the hat, when partly felted, a finer and more valuable material in the same direction it has when on the back of the animal. So in a way, it was kind of like a veneer. It was still being passed off as a beaver hat on the outside, but on the inside, it was anything but. And the reason for the creation for this new product, it said that these are a middle class between cordies and stuffs. So cordies, the common, most affordable woolen hat, and stuff hats would have been that mixture of all beaver and old coat. So these hats were designed as a substitute for the latter at a more reasonable expense, because the expensive material beaver is scarcely ever used except in the outward nap, and the body of the hat is composed of various inferior stuffs in any proportion. So this is a picture of a plaited, or sometimes called warm hat. And you can see on the outside that nap of beaver is kind of wearing away up at the top there. You can see the body of the hat is kind of being exposed on the underneath, and that body would not have been made of beaver. So this was really the best option for the majority of people. There might have still been some people who really wanted that quality all beaver hat and would have paid whatever it cost to get that. But the majority of gentlemen at the time, they couldn't afford that. So they needed this good middleman. So the question is, do you think that people cared that these plated hats were veneers? I'll give you a modern day example. If you could buy this purse at that price compared to this purse at that price, and let's say you weren't an avid Gucci enthusiast, most people would probably buy the top purse. And that's the same way that it was back then. People just wanted the look. They wanted what that purse or that hat would have represented in society. So this trend actually continued for some time, even when hats were being made with no beaver. There's a quote by Isaac Taylor, who was a writer in 1839. He said, "The hats commonly called beaver hats, though for common purposes they have no beaver on them, consist of wool and rabbit's fur entangled together in a sort of cloth-like substance called felt." So we can see it was a little tricky because they were still being advertised as beaver hats just because the outside was beaver, but the inside wasn't. So that leads to the question. So if the outside of this hat was beaver, what was the inside made out of? And according to this quote, he says, fur consisting of wool and rabbit's fur, so they would have been made with inferior felting materials, inferior animal furs such as rabbit, hare, nutria, and eventually silk hat. So these inferior furs, they took a lot more time and effort to felt. They required chemicals and a lot more steps to try to imitate that natural feltability of the beaver. It's also interesting to note that mercury was probably not needed on beaver because it was naturally feltable. So when factories did discover that mercury would help in felting these other animal furs, although when they discovered it and how they discovered it is still a little fuzzy, it was implemented in hat making, and by the 1840s, it was pretty prevalent. So because of mercury, hat factories were kind of given the green light. They were able to mass produce hats. That means that more factories were opening, more people were being employed in these factories. And because of that, thousands of workers were exposed to mercurial vapors and eventually contracted mercury poisoning. And mercury poisoning is not a pretty thing. And there's a whole appendix in the back of the article that you can read that goes into the specific side effects of mercury poisoning. And there's a whole section on Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, and where did he get his inspiration for that Mad Hatter character. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, go ahead and read that. It's also interesting to know that all these workers that were working in these factories around mercury, they didn't have labor laws at the time to protect them in their work environment from harsh chemicals. And it wasn't until 1906 that they could even file for compensation. But by then, it was really hard for people to prove that they had gotten mercury poisoning all those years ago when they worked in the hat factories. So again, the timeline for mercury in the use of hatting is a little fuzzy, but the first medical reports of the use of mercury in hatting appeared in 1860. And this was quite a while after a rendezvous period. This was about 20 years after the rendezvous period. And the first report was by a Dr. J. Addison Freeman. And he says, it appears on inquiry that occasional cases of the disease have been known to occur among hatters for many years back, that it was not uncommon among hatters in Germany, so that if mercury is introduced at all, it must be in some process more or less common at different times and in different countries. He also says, hence it seems to be established that in carroting, which is the process that they would put mercury on the pelts, to a greater or less extent is incorporated into the hat body, and that whenever it is exposed to a temperature high enough, the mercury will be volatilized and the workmen exposed to the effects of its absorption. We find too that the greater prevalence of the disease of late seems to be owing to the use of poorer material than usual and the consequent greater use of mercury. So he mentions that yes, mercury could have been used pre-1840, but there was not a lot of evidence. There weren't a lot of people coming forward at the time being exposed or having these side effects of mercury poisoning. It wasn't until after 1840, when he wrote his report in 1860, that he really saw these effects of mercury poisoning. And I put together a little equation just to keep everything kind of straight, because there's a lot going on here. So the decrease in the use of beaver in hatting equaled the increase of lesser quality materials used for these hats, which required more mercury because of they didn't felt as well, and also because of the higher demand for hats in general. They needed to just whip these hats out with these poor quality material, and so they needed to use mercury to do that. And that led to more cases of mercury poisoning in hatters after the 1840s. And I say after the 1840s because that's, again, when our rendezvous period ended. So the conclusion of this whole talk, of the whole article, is really that beaver coming out of the Rocky Mountains was, yes, going back to hat factories, but only a small percentage of the beaver was actually being implemented into each individual hat. And mercury was most likely not being widely used during this time, although hats were being made with lesser quality material, because based on medical reports, it'd be a while after the rendezvous that large amounts of people would start exhibiting symptoms of mercury poisoning, showing that mercury was not as big a player during the time of the rendezvous as what was once previously thought. So after doing all this research now, when I have to give a tour to somebody at the museum, and I start with my beaver case up at the front, I'm going to have a little bit different of a story to tell when it comes to beaver in top hats and the use of mercury.
Are there any questions?
Oh yeah, sorry. Questions that I hope I can answer.
What was the reason that the hats were built so high?
But, oh, you know, it was just a fashion trend. That was just, it was something that shocked people when they first saw it. And so it's kind of like today when a new fashion trend comes out, people just like the look of it and they want to try to replicate it.
Do you know what time period they stopped using the mercury process in felting?
Yes, so mercury wasn't made a notifiable disease until 1899, and it was after that, and not even until 1906, that they started putting some labor laws in place. They had to let their factory workers start using gloves when they were using it to brush it onto the pelts. And then also the majority of people were exposed in the steam rooms in a step called basoning. And a lot of those times, those steam rooms were very small, and they would have like hardly any ventilation. So some of the suggestions were to put them in larger, more ventilated rooms to help them not breathe in as many of the vapors. So.
Yeah, this is a question I have. I'm curious about. Although the rendezvous ended about 1840, there was a certain amount of trading that occurred afterwards and such. And so I wonder if you have any concept of a lag time between the delivery of plues to the hatters after from the mountain regions. Yet then would the hatters have to stockpile them, or would they immediately go into production? In other words, would they have been able to use an 1838 traded plume in 1845, or was the use of these beaver furs pretty much as soon as they arrived at the hatters?
Yeah, so we can assume, based on just the demand of hats at the time, that they were probably, you know, beaver was such a valuable resource to them. So probably as soon as it came to the factories, they were wanting to utilize it as quick as possible to make a hat, to sell it, to, you know, make a profit off of that. It is interesting in the manual, at the very beginning of the manual actually describes when the hatters received the material. It talked about bales of wool for the cordies, and then these pelts that then they would have to process them. So it does sound like there were a quantity of pelts probably stacked up at the time that they received them. So I don't think it was probably one at a time type thing, and they probably did use them right away just to make a profit. So anybody else? Yes? Oh, I think he's bringing a microphone for you.
So when they would use the mercury on the beaver for the hats, did they run it through like a steam room, or did they How did they apply it?
Yeah, so there were actually two main steps. So the main step was called carroting, and that was typically when they would receive the prepared pelts. They would brush a mercurial solution. Usually it was mercury nitrate or some other form of compound. And yeah, so that was done. One of the first steps, so they would probably absorb that through their hands a lot of the times. But the most dangerous were in those steam-filled rooms where they would, it's a step called basoning. They would have to basically boil them in a mercury solution for quite a while. And that was just because of the vapors, because of the steam inhalation. And then another step that is actually, to me, the most interesting is called the bowing. And that would be when they would basically use this long bow tool to kind of pluck and separate the fibers of the pelts. And so they'd be flying all over the room. So you can imagine that many of the workers probably were inhaling mercury-laden fibers at the time. So those are the three main steps that they would use mercury. Any other questions? Yeah.
Most of the poisoning was from the factory workers. It wasn't from the people that were actually wearing the hat.
Yeah, and that is actually an interesting question because in my research, there's a modern day fashion historian that she went in and she had tested some of the museum artifacts, so the original top hats, and some of them did actually leach a small percentage of mercury. So we can assume that some of the gentlemen were probably contracting a little bit of effects from the mercury, but it definitely wasn't near anything that the workers were that were exposed to it day after day. Yes?
So we know that Fort Clatsop was found largely because of the presence of mercury in the soil. And we know that it was Lewis that was administering that as a medicinal product to the soldiers while they were at Fort Clatsop, and that's why they were there. So it was used a lot as a medicinal thing. In fact, when I was a kid, we had mercurochrome or methylene, which was a mercury-based infectant or infects bacteria dies under the presence of
Yeah, I know Scott was actually telling me that that's how Lewis and Clark had set up their camp in a typical government fashion. And so based on the documents to show where the latrine was, that's where they went to find it. And that's exactly where it was because of the mercury in the soil. So it's really interesting to see that a lot of people were taking something that they thought was good for their health, but probably wasn't in the long run. Any more questions?
So did the hat started to fall out of fashion around the same time that the sources of beaver started to dry up? Is there any evidence to suggest that maybe the fashion was artificially changed, or maybe they kind of manufactured, hey, this is a new fashion in response to the lesser beaver thing to try and avoid the market just completely drying up?
Yeah, and I know definitely silk was one of the main things that people attribute to kind of the decline of the fur trade. And it's just kind of like today with different fashion trends, when something new comes in and enough people start, getting on board with it, then the old stuff is kind of phased out. And I think that the factories were maybe not knowingly, but they were already starting to phase out these beaver hats just with the plated hat, because they knew that it wasn't made of all beaver. And then so, probably at that time it wasn't as important to have an all beaver hat, or even just the connotation of what a beaver hat meant when it comes to fashion. So, okay, thank you guys.
We're going to need a few minutes to set up, I believe. This is another experiment right now. We're going to live stream Dr. Bill Swagerty's talk, and he's in California. So, in fact, there he is. So as soon as we get everything set up, I'll introduce Dr. Swagerty, and his talk will be about stereotypes of the mountain men and mountain traders. And he has spent decades studying these stereotypes, and his studies and his analysis of statistical information suggests new ways that we can view the trappers and traders, and also new directions that we ought to take our study of this period.
So are you there, Bill? Do you want to unmute so we can hear you?
I am here.
All right. Do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Yeah, let's see now. I need to get this one in. Yeah, there we go. So I need to share this one. Right? There's
Yes.
there's my PowerPoint. I'm sharing it.
Yep. Go ahead and start the PowerPoint.
Okay, slideshow from beginning.
Okay, I think you're good to go.
Okay. Dr. Bill Swagerty was born in New Mexico, earned degrees from Colorado College, University of California at Santa Barbara. He served as an administrator at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He's taught at the University of Idaho, and since 2001, he has taught at the University of the Pacific. And as I was saying, he has spent years researching this period in history, and his insights as far as stereotypes that were developing even as trappers were still in the water setting traps up until the current day. And he really got me to look at material that I've been looking at for years with new eyes. So here's Dr. Swagerty.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Museum of the Mountain Man, for inviting me to talk at a distance, and my apology to the audience for having to be here in California. I've had a pretty severe case of shingles, and am a little bit nervous even as I speak today from some of the medicine I'm on. So forgive me if I have to stop and clear my eye where I got the shingles 4 months ago, actually, but I'm still recovering. This is a subject very dear to my interest. I got interested in it because of a debate that was taking place even as I was an undergraduate student at Colorado College between two very eminent historians who got into an academic duel over stereotypes of the mountain men. One was a Pulitzer Prize winner, that being William H. Getzmann of the University of Texas at Austin, and the other my professor, Dr. Harvey L. Carter at Colorado College. And here you see their two pictures. They got into a nasty fight, which didn't end with just one article or two articles. There was quite a bit of exchange between the two in the academic forum of the Western History Association, the most eminent organization of those of us who do Western history. And it started really with Dr. Getzmann's 1963 article that I'll show you next. But it was Carter who really picked the fight, because he was very upset with Getzmann for describing mountain men as no different than their Jacksonian cousins. That is, they were just men out there to make money, and it didn't matter what the occupation was. They just took the job because it was available. So in his article written with a former student, Marcia Spencer, in 1975, Carter took on Getzmann and then used his own statistical data based upon the recent publication of Leroy Hafan's Mountain Men and the Fur Trade of the Far West, the 10 volumes, to really take on Dr. Getzmann. Now, Getzmann in 1963 had postulated this thesis in the American Quarterly, the journal of the American Studies Association. He was a young 30-year-old professor. He had a lot of brash. He had a very good background academically. And 3 years later, he would win the Pulitzer Prize, actually 4 years, for his 1966 book, which many of you probably have on your bookshelves, Exploration and Empire, which is an excellent study. The mountain men section is very small in this book. And it was this article in American Quarterly that stimulated Carter's interest in taking him on. What was his evidence? That these guys were no different than their Jacksonian cousins. Well, he used the target year of 1845. And I should say, I talked with him about this a couple of times. His students took this on as a seminar project. So they really did the research for him, as is the case with many professors at graduate universities like Texas. They compared 446 men who had been active in the fur trade. They found only 5 still trapping by 1845. 17 others were still active as traders. They noted that 182 of 446, or about 40%, had been killed while active in the trade, either by Indians or accidents. And of the known later occupations of 100 men, including that they could discern, ranching, farming, mining, distilling, politics, banking, and government employment were the dominant occupations in that rank order. In short, they concluded that former mountain men were no different than their Jacksonian era cousins, were expectant capitalists at heart. So with Hafen's monumental mountain men and the fur trade of the far west, which many of you own, and which all of us use as our base for many of our statistical and our collective biographical studies, Carter decided to write this article. He had contributed about 13% of the articles in the Hafen series, more than any other person, and was well known, of course, for his studies of Christopher Kit Carson. He still is the leading biographer of Carson, with his Dear Old Kit in 1968 and his book with Thelma Gilman in 1984, A Pattern for Heroes, as he called Kit Carson. Here's Carson and the earliest known daguerreotype of him. I love this, this photograph, which has him in a beaver hat, no less. Carter and Spencer used 3 stereotypes, and I'm going to talk about a 4th that I think is important later on in my talk, but 3 at the time. And those were the heroic mountain man, the delinquent mountain man, and the expectant capitalist of William H. Guessman. And his stats are shown here. He shows on the basis of the survey that he did of around 300 men, or what he calculated to be about 10% of the total of 3,000 active in the fur trade, primarily in the Rocky Mountains, but also on the West Coast and in the Southwest. But again, using Hafen's series, most of them active in the heartland where you people are today in the Rocky Mountain West. And these were his stats. Many of you know this article. You've probably seen it repeated a few times over the years. And you can see there that he's not very convinced that the mountain man was the Jacksonian cousin that Guessman had talked about. Now, who were the dominant men that he was looking at? Well, these were the leading mountain men, and he based that on the number of lines in the index to the Hafen series. It's somewhat arbitrary, but that was his method. And of course, our friend William Sublette, who's been talked about today, and Ashley and Bridger, Wyeth, his own favorite son, Christopher Carson, etc., are in that group. So many of the people that we're familiar with, and most of them Anglos or Scots or Brits in general, very few of them even French, which shows you the misrepresentation in terms of numbers, percentages, even of the more famous mountain men. Well, that gets us to the stereotypes. Where did they come from? Well, both of the dominant stereotypes that started out in Carter's survey, that is the romantic hero and the the daring but degenerate, as he called it, or the delinquent would be another way of looking at it, came from Washington Irving, the New York-based writer, very famous for a lot of his work. And the idea of the expectant capitalist came out of the 1836 book, A Story, which John Jacob Astor commissioned Irving to write based upon his own memoirs, his own records of the American Fur Company right there in New York. And the second book, the next year, appeared as The Adventures of Captain Bonneville, which included many examples of daring but degenerate or delinquent mountain men in the West who cared not for laws, not for anyone telling them what to do, etc. So here's John Jacob Astor at his desk in 1815, friend of Irving and contemporary, and Captain Benjamin Bonneville, born in Paris, but died in the United States and very famous for this one expedition out west that included, of course, many mountain men in the passages that Irving wrote, including Joseph Rediford Walker and others. So the notes on travel that he had access to, the records of the American Fur Company, were the important sources. But the point here is Irving had absolutely no firsthand experience out west. He didn't even interview, as far as I can tell, people who had come back to the East Coast who had been part of the experience itself. So this is written as a third party, really, not even as a second party. But it was very popular. It became, both books became bestsellers for their day. And here's what he said about the mountaineers. He called them mountaineers and not mountain men. He said, traders and trappers that scale the vast mountain chains and pursue their hazardous vocations amidst their wild recesses. They are hardy, lithe, vigorous, and active, extravagant in word and thought and deed, heedless of hardship, daring of danger, prodigal of the present, and thoughtless of the future. There is no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement, and who are more enamored of their occupation than the free trappers of the West. And of course, we've seen from the art of Alfred Jacob Miller already today, the importance of that as a primary source. Miller added to the stereotypes, every one of them, in one way or another, but his idea of trappers, or his reminiscences and his on-site sketching of trappers in buckskin, certainly fed into the stereotypes. And here we have trappers, 1837, actually painted on the spot and then later repainted in oil several times and in several of our leading art galleries. And John Clymer, the Jackson Hole-based artist, and my favorite of fur trade era, Skins and Scalps, 1973, showing perhaps the degenerate or daring but delinquent stereotype. And then this one, this wasn't painted until 1845, but again, sketched on the spot by Alfred Jacob Miller and at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, and probably the most reproduced image of Alfred Jacob Miller showing trappers taking an Indian bride, of a theme of this talk and many others. So the daring but degenerate stereotype really got its start with several men who traveled in the 1840s. Ruxton, George Ruxton, Brit, very important account. Edwin Bryant, What I Saw in California, came out the following year. Francis Parkman, the famous Brahmin from Boston, actually went over the Oregon Trail as far as Fort Laramie. And his California and Oregon Trail came out in 1849. And then Louis Hector Gerard, in that trek from Cincinnati all the way to Taos, Watoya, and the Taos Trail, 1850. And I'm quoting here just one of them, Ruxton, who said, the trappers of the Rocky Mountains belong to a genus more approximating to the primitive savage than perhaps any other class of civilized men. Constantly exposed to perils of all kinds, they become callous to the feeling of danger and destroy human as well as animal life with as little scruple and as freely as they expose their own. Of laws, human or divine, they neither know nor care to know. So that really reinforced any kind of idea that the mountain men were an iconoclastic group of nonconformists in their own era. And here, another John Clymer that reinforces this is Whiskey, Whiskey, coming into Rendezvous, Pretty Thirsty, a 1973 painting. I got interested in this by taking a class with Dr. Carter in 1971, and then teaching at Colorado College a year and a half in the 70s, and then seeing Dr. Carter over the years up to his death many times at reunions. I'm talking with him a lot about this subject, but I was also influenced by Ed Bingham of the University of Oregon, who never really published much on this subject. He did a little book designed for college students, but and included some thoughts on this, but he should have published this article, a very good manuscript on the American mountain men and fact, fiction and in fact, written in the 1970s. And I credit Bing with interest that was stimulated beyond Dr. Carter. I wrote my article, my original one, 40 years ago, I guess it is. In 1980, in the Western History Quarterly, I'd given it as a paper at the Chicago Westerners. I was working at the Newberry Library at the time. And I won a little award with an Old Joe the Buffalo award you see here, and was pretty proud of it. And the basis for it really was just the Hafen series. I used 312 men, 287 out of the Hafen series, and then an additional few that I knew about. And the most important note that I have in this is note number 1, that the estimate of 3,000 trappers and traders was based upon Carter and supported by Hafen. And this was something that was important to me, that I was at least getting about 10% of the mountain men who Carter thought were active in the West, most of whom were illiterate, didn't leave records, etc. So that was my note number 1. And then I credited Getzman with his 446, or about 45% of the total, he thought, of about 991, which was way short of the 3,000 that Carter and Spencer thought were active. And I talked with Hafen about this a couple of times. I only met him 3 times, but I mentioned it to him, and he said, yeah, Carter Harvey's got it right. It's about 3,000. I don't think he ever published that, but it's something that's welded into my memory from a meeting with him in Santa Fe. So my stats over here are not as important as what you have in the article that I just published in the journal, which includes my variables for the 312 men that I looked at in 1980. And this was the galley page. You can see a correction there from that's now in the journal that shows as an appendix what I looked at. I used a very old-fashioned statistical program called the social, I forget exactly what it was, to tell you the truth, but it was at the Northwestern University. It cost me $60 an hour to run this computer most of the night using punch cards, and came up with these cross tabulations that are in that original article and many more. Now, one thing I found that I didn't really pursue in that article, but I'm working on it now as a book, is that most mountain men didn't just vanish. They didn't go back east and never return to the trade as Covington did. They ended up settling in retirement communities, or at least we can find a goodly percentage of them in certain places, in certain regions, if not in exact locales. And I had this in my original article, that the Pacific Northwest had the most, with St. Louis and Kansas City, second, California, etc. And that was on the basis of 297 of them that I could actually find locations. And so my conclusions from that, with my data set of 312, was that the average man worked 15 years in the trade. And that's pretty good for the 19th century. And there's some truth to both the expectant capitalist of Getzman, certainly Robert Campbell and J.J. Astor, William Ashley, many others qualify for that. But the romantic hero stereotype of Carson and Bridger and many others is also accurate. So there are modest examples of a number of examples of men who became wealthy, and really most of them are officers in the Hudson's Bay Company who end up getting pretty good pensions and retirement settlements back in England or at Red River or in Victoria after 1843. And the owners of companies. And again, we have those three examples. The average man married 1.5 times, did not have multiple wives, although he may have had multiple girlfriends, I guess we'd call them, or partners. And the marriages produced on average 3.5 children, I found. And the big problem was this: lacking a system of Social Security, many decided, really out of necessity or just out of desire to stay with their friends, to congregate into these retirement communities. Some organized by companies. The Hudson Bay Company did a pretty good job of that. But most were self-designated, or by default, they just stayed where they were, near old trading posts like Fort Bridger or Fort Colville. So there's a problem in method in all of this for all of us who looked at the stats on the mountain men from these biographies that have been produced over the years since the 19th century. Very much skewed by those who were literate. Only 15% of Hafen's mountain men left diaries, letters, extensive records, according to Richard Fairman, who did an article in volume 10 on that. It's very Anglo-centric, lacking the majority of fur trade personnel who are French Canadian or American French Creole, most of them illiterate, most of them making their mark or having someone write for them, and most of them having 3-year or 5-year contracts, and that's about all we know of them. They were part of the marginal men identified by Jim Hansen and Samantha Eckleberry, and by Canadian scholars, certainly, who've looked at, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink here, the records of the American Fur Company out of Montreal and the American Fur Company records out of St. Louis, the two biggest data sets that we have on contract labor. So we need to expand those occupational groups to those who were once active in fur trade pursuits who moved on. Maybe guys like our Covington, who moved on to another occupation after only 1 year. But those guys are hard to find. They're very hard to find. And I would argue that there's been a lack of focus on families and communities associated with fur trade personnel. We're more interested in the men and in the heroic or even the degenerate side of these men during their active years. It's sort of like looking at modern movies and wanting action movies, not movies about family life. And I would say that the latter is really important. So my current project is on these retirement communities from the 1820s to around 1900. I've included a lot of people who you might think were not part of fur trade country, but I'm finding that at one point or another, they were connected with fur trade company. And that's not my most important criterion, but the decades of activity are. Nearly all of them knew fur trade personnel or were friends with or were active at some point, even if only for a short time. So it's our traditional people, trappers, traders, clerks, factors, owners, the guys we know from Hafen and from other studies, but also sea otter hunters, especially those from California to Alaska. Pretty good literature on that. Sea merchants who immigrated to California and Oregon and who established communities. I have a pretty good database on that now. I didn't know a thing about hide drogers when I started this. I didn't even know what that word meant. And it's the guys who are land-based who actually traded to the Mexican ranches and to the missions for the hides, produced mainly by the Indian inmates at the California missions. And they traded them to people like the owners of the ships that came from Boston. They brought people like Dana, who wrote 2 years before the mast. And he talks quite a bit about these guys. Also early overland trail immigrants who were guided by former fur trade personnel, and many of the latter, as well as the overland trailers, ended up founding communities. And then finally, the Bear Flag Republic participants, some with Fremont, others already in California, but many of the mountain men or former mountain men. So finally, the communities I'm looking at are these. I'm looking at St. Joseph in Greater Kansas City, the Rosebud Reservation that included quite a few of the men who married Sioux, women in Nebraska, what today is Nebraska and the middle part of the Midwest, French Prairie, Oregon City, Champouie in Oregon, Nisqually, Vancouver, and Colville in Washington. Near you people, Robertson, Fort Bridger, and Wind River, Taos and Santa Fe in New Mexico, where I hail from, Pueblo, Hardscrabble, Greenhorn, and Boggsville in Colorado, Frenchtown, just outside of Missoula toward Idaho, and the Flathead Reservation to the north, Napa, Yountville, Monterey, San Diego, and Santa Barbara in California. And in closing, I would just say that I have 3 images, and the first one is my friend John Clymer, Buckskin Brigade, 1972. I think what's important in this painting is not what's at the front, but what's at the back. All these families, these Indian women, children, all these people trailing the leaders of the brigade, most of whom were either Anglo, French Canadian, French American, or Métis mixed. And then finally, this slide showing, after photography, families, actual husbands and wives. And in this case, the child, Joe, young Joe Culbertson, in a photograph taken in 1863 in Illinois, and James Bordeaux and his wife, Marie, from the famous Museum of the Fur Trade site in Chadron, Nebraska. So I suggest that we start looking at this 4th stereotype that I'm working on now a little bit more seriously, and look at mountain men as family men and community builders. Thank you very much. I'm ready for questions.
Does anybody have questions?
For your professor, for your retirement communities, are you including any that are in Canada?
Well, I've done a lot of work on the Canadian side, but I decided in this book, which University of Nebraska is going to publish, and the lead part of it is the article that you have in the journal this year, the first 26 pages out of about 200. I decided pretty much to restrict it to this side of the border. I considered the Fraser River, including that. I've done a lot of work on that. And I thought about Red River. Oh my. But if I started including all of that, this thing would blossom into the project like I did with Lewis and Clark, which ended up taking me 12 years and 2 big volumes. So I decided, no, let's just stick to kind of the American West. I am crossing over a little bit, but not much. If the Canadians come down here, yes, they're included. But I'm not going up there to find them.
So one thing that came to my mind was, as you were showing the sources for stereotypes,
Right.
I'm taken back to all the notes that are included in by Alfred Jacob Miller with his paintings, and I think he adds greatly to that stereotype of both hero / degenerate trapper. Do you consider that as part of that stereotype, or because many of those were written in the 1850 to 1860 time frame, that was, after the romanticized, and he was just picking up on that?
Well, that's a really good question, and you're asking a question that's going to force me to look more seriously at Alfred Jacob Miller's notes, and I think it is important where we can determine when he painted something and when he actually added the notes to put a date line on it. But the fact that he was there, if so briefly, but there nonetheless. In person, eyewitness, documentary source, and the best painters record that we have of the Rendezvous period forces us really to say, yes, he is an important source. And so, for example, his paintings of Pierre, I think those are very important for understanding that the prototype of the French Canadians who were active in the fur trade, who had wives and who had families that actually trailed them in the fur trade on the fur trade cycle. They just didn't go out by themselves. As was also the case, of course, with the Hudson Bay Company brigades, like the one that came down here to California with 400 to 500 people, most of them women and children, on their annual trek down here to where I live in the San Joaquin Valley. So yes, I will look at that more carefully. I know Lisa Strong in her book, Sentimental Journey, really paid attention to that. And I have her book and I'm going to go back to it and take a closer look. Thank you.
Professor, I'll just call you that for short. Just a couple of comments. One of the things that I found about the Alfred Jacob Miller paintings, I found this at the University of Wyoming a number of years ago, and under the family of May Reed Porter, who did quite a bit in the resurrection of those prints, a copy of the original Miller drawings and sketches. And from that big catalog of pictures and photographs, or not photographs, but drawings, there's some incredible history on really what those people that he painted hereafter differs greatly from his original sketches. I don't know if you've ever run across that particular big sketchbook of his or not, but there's, it's an incredible piece of work for looking at that. The other comment that I had that was interesting that you talked about the Irving things. One of the things that I concluded about Irving was he was a romantic writer. And he was one of the few writers who ever really used footnotes, maybe 5 or 6 in that whole book, Astoria. But what led me to really gain some information on that was Edgley Todd's editing of that entire book, Astoria, that really sorts out the romance from the actual happenings. And I was wondering, is there any others of those kinds of books that have been edited like that?
I'm sorry, who are you? I don't see you in my screen.
Well, I'm just a small guy here. My name is Steve, and I'm from Du Bois, Wyoming.
Okay, very good, Steve. I agree with you that Edgley Todd's editing is one of the best things we have, one of the best edited editions that we have. I used that one myself. You know, he did the, he went through the 1837 edition and really did a nice job in reprinting it through University of Oklahoma Press. There aren't too many writers prior to Francis Parkman who actually used any kind of scientific notation, and even Parkman was very select in telling us, you know, his sources as he went, as he wrote his France and England and North America series, but also the Oregon Trail book. But yeah, Irving gets a very positive nod for being ahead of his time for providing footnotes. That said, I'm a little hard on him for not really providing, it seemed like he would have had access to money to pay people if necessary, and certainly the contacts in New York to interview people who had been out west more than he did. He wanted to get the book out as fast as possible. He was being paid to do it, etc. But he did a good job of, yeah, adding notes. Certainly, he certainly gave us from the I've edited sections of the American Fur Company papers, the St. Louis ones, and I've looked pretty extensively through Annie Abel's indexes to the papers in New York and have the entire microfilm version of that. And he certainly did a good job of using Astor's own records. Hats off to him for that.
Hey, Bill, do you want to take just a few seconds and stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, I can't see what anyone else is seeing. I'm seeing blank screens on both of them.
Well, we're seeing a small screen of you, but if you quit sharing, we'll only see you.
Okay,
Should be right at the top.
yeah, there we go.
That's good. Thank you. You're not going to be able to see us.
Okay,
Is there any other questions?
Well, thank you very much, Dr.
I have a
Swagerty.
question for you.
There's a question.
How
Yes,
are the buffalo burgers?
they are excellent. They are outstanding. We'll mail you one.
I miss that so much. I so enjoy those rendezvous there in Pinedale. That's one of my favorite places, and I'm just sorry I'm not there in person. And thank you very much for inviting me to do this.
We'll consider it a rain check and come out in person as soon as you can. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for doing this. And that ends this afternoon's presentations. We'll have 2 more presentations tomorrow. Right now, it would have just started as a presentation out at the Mountain Man Camp on the business of the fur trade. So you'd walk past the museum and into the campsite area. Clint, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, right. We're going to go ahead and show Bad Hands videotape on weapons here. And it'll take me just a couple minutes to switch over to video, but we'll be doing the weapons video here. So, and don't forget the movie tonight. We're going to see tonight at 6:30 is the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal Awards and book signing. So if you want to get your journal signed, you can by the authors, except for Bill. And then also at 7, we're going to play Centennial, the second episode of Centennial called The Yellow Apron. And afterwards, we'll have a discussion by some fur trade experts. And we have free beer and pizza. If the movie doesn't bring you, maybe the pizza and beer will.
And I have one more thing to add. If you're interested in how hats are manufactured, we have that manual in the museum available.
Yeah, we'll try to get it available. We don't have it available at the front desk right now, but there's a book called The Day in the Hat Factory. It's an 1841 pamphlet on making a beaver hat. We also have copies of Arlaina's 1829 fur trade manual, which isn't illustrated. The Day in the Hat Factory is illustrated. So, but we don't. If you go to the front desk right now, they won't know what you're talking about. So, I will try to correct that tonight, and by tomorrow, have some of them there at the front desk.
Well, thank you very much for coming.